Hi, I'm DJ Ware. On this episode of the Cyber Gizmo, I'm going to be taking the reverse Linus Tech Tip Challenge. They are, both Linus and Luke, are spending a month to try out Linux. So, as Windows users. So I, as a Linux user, am going to spend a month and try out Windows. So, I mean, it's only fair, right? I mean, turnabout is fair play. So that's what I'm going to be doing right after this. Where to begin? So let's talk about the challenge that they established. These are their rules. And those are the same rules I am going to be following as well. So they have 5 parts. The first part is to install a distro and a game. That's all you had to do for week 1. Week 2, they had to get streaming up and running on the platform. And that would be whatever they needed in order to do streaming a video to YouTube, I would assume, and also Twitch. 3, get as many game launchers running in Linux as possible. Now that probably doesn't make a lot of sense going from Windows because there's a lot of games that are written natively for Windows. And there's game launchers like Steam, but that's, Anyway, what I will replace that with is try to get as many open source applications running on Windows natively, not using WSL. We're going to put Windows to the test and see if it can bend to look like Linux without installing WSL. Part 4, edit a video, create a document, print the document, and then play around with Netflix. And then week 5, sit back, do some conclusion and remarks, and then determine what their next step is, whether to go back to Windows or to stay on Linux. So that is the plan. So what did I do this week? So this week is very short. I mean, we're already into Wednesday, but what I did actually was spend some time and pick out the machine out of my stuff here, which one I was going to try to install Windows on, with the goal being to get to Windows 11. So that's the latest release, and that's where I was going to go. I have set up painstakingly, first time I have installed Windows 10 in a long time. So I have set up Windows 10. I have installed it with a few apps, not a whole lot, just a few. I have Windows 10 Home. It's installed on a laptop, and the laptop is fairly recent, so we're going to check and make sure that it has all of the requirements that I need for Windows 11. And then we're going to try to install it today. I haven't done this. I haven't practiced this, so you're going to get what you get. If it works, it works. If it fails, well, that's just the way it'll be. So, all right. So the first thing I want to do is I've come over to here, this download page, and one of the things that suggests that I do is I install the PC Health Check app, which I have done. And I have it up and running. I have not actually done the check yet, so I have no idea what this machine is going to do. So let's just see what happens. Wow, look at that. So yeah, I knew this machine had most of the things in it that they were looking for, so which is the reason why I chose this machine. So yeah, so it meets all the minimum requirements. We should be able to get this done. Now I have updated, I think. So I'm a little rusty in here. But I have applied all the updates, and you can see it also agrees that I can run Windows 11. But we'll check one more time just to make sure, because Windows likes to hide its updates, unlike Linux, where you can run this thing 4 times in a row, and it'll still be showing you updates that you need to do. So I think we have them all, and I think we're good to go. At least that's been my experience so far with it. So remember, I'm taking this from the viewpoint of a Linux user. They were taking it from the viewpoint of using Linux as a Windows user. So I'm doing the opposite. So that's the idea. So the looks like the best option for me is to run the Windows 11 installation assistant because that allows me to install Windows 11 on the device I'm currently using. So they also have the ability to create the installation media. And last time I did allude to this. If this does not work if you download it onto an ISO on Linux and then use a Linux tool to install that ISO onto a CD. It will not work. You have to use this method in order for it to actually work. This ISO is not bootable. I had a number of people say, well, I did this, it worked just fine. Bullshit. No, you didn't. There is no bootable partition in that ISO. Sorry about that, but I have checked. There is no bootable partition there. So anyway, so before I begin, let's take a look, make sure I've upgraded my 10. It provides those who want to upgrade, right? So before you begin, you have a Windows 10 license. Yes, I have an active Windows 10 license. It's from a long time ago. I had to actually bring my Windows 8 license over. So yeah, that's how long it's been. So PC must have Windows 10 version 2004. Yeah, it does. Meets the following device upgrade requirements, support features, certain features require additional hardware. We also recommend you visit your PC. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. And you have to have 9 gig. That's fine. Got all that. Select run, and you need to be administrator to run this tool. All right. Fair enough. And so we're just going to download it. Guess I better go to the download folder. So let me drag that over here. If I can find which way I need to go on the monitor to get there. There we go, and we'll drag this back. This is one of my big complaints with Windows, is that I always have to, there's no way to specify which one is your default display if you're using a laptop. Your secondary display that is hung off of an HDMI port, no, you can't do that. You can on Linux, however. So there's one complaint right there. I'm getting my complaints in early. You can disagree with me, that's fine. There's my installation assistant. I've done it twice, so I just want to do. So I'm going to run as administrator. Let's run it as administrator. And then I got to go back over here, drag this window back over here. I love it. Okay. I'm going to go back. Anytime it opens a window, it wants to put it on the main display, which, yeah. I'm not trying to be nasty. I'm just being fair. So these are things that I find annoying. All right, so I'm downloading now, and I'll advance the video if these take forever. But I mean, they were having fun with us. I mean, turnabout's fair play, right? No, actually, I mean, I understand that, you know, it is, Linux has a reputation of being very difficult to install. And hopefully by the end of the lesson that I'm about to start, hopefully by the end of that lesson, you'll find that that is not true. At the time I started to install Windows 10, and the time I was finished took me about an hour and 30 minutes. Then to get through the update cycle, to install the apps that I wanted, to put the drivers on that I needed for my laptop, you're looking at least another hour or two for that. So total of about 3 hours in total to install Windows from ground up with no, you know, a lot of guys when they're doing gaming PC reviews, they'll have a Windows SSD already set up that they can just plop in and go, and I can understand that. I mean, if it's taking you that long to install an OS, yeah. And then I back-to-back installed Debian, and I had to install one driver. So Debian took about 8 minutes to install. The driver, it took me a little bit of time to figure out which one I needed, so maybe another 30 minutes on top of that. So 38 minutes total, and most of that was just groundwork, trying to figure out what I needed in the machine. So yeah, it's not always clear sometimes which chipset is in your machine. It did tell me Intel, but then when I was looking at the number of Intel firmware updates, there was a lot. So I had to narrow it down to something called the AVR400 or something. But anyway, that worked, and it came up and ran for the Wi-Fi. So yeah, it just, all computers are going to be headaches. They all are. I don't care what they are. None of them are particularly easy and free to use. I think that my personal feeling is that we have a tendency as users that once we've been using a platform for a while, we attempt to make that platform want to work like what we're used to. A long time ago, I discovered that the easiest way to deal with that situation is forget about what it is the way you used your old platform. Make sure that your new platform you're moving to, whether that be Linux or Windows or Mac OS, make sure whatever platform you're moving to has the applications that you need in order to get your work done, and then take the time to learn the particulars of the system that you're on. I think that now I know they're gamers and they're pretty much. I mean, gaming is pretty much a Windows ecosystem. So there are a few Linux games, but by and large, most of the new games and the most popular titles are going to be written specifically for Windows. So you don't really have a choice there. You have to bend Linux to make it look like Windows. Well, yeah, that's going to be hit and miss. I mean, Linux is not Windows, and Windows is not Linux. Even with WSL in Windows, it's still not Linux. Also, we also have a tendency to try to keep using the type of file transfers, for example, the type of screen sharing applications, for example, that we know from, let's say, I was coming from Windows, I probably would be using RDP, remote desktop, and I would probably be using their version of CIFS. So for my file storage, and those are not optimal. Neither one of those are optimal for Linux. Linux has its own set of screen sharing applications, and it has its own set. NFS is the preferred method on Linux to do file sharing. So, I mean, if you're trying to bend the OS to make Linux be Windows or Windows be Linux, you're never going to be happy with that. The best way to do it is to forget about trying to bend it. Instead, you bend and learn the systems as they are. Because that's what I did when I moved over to Linux. Finally, I just said, okay, I knew Mac and I knew Windows when I came over, and I knew Unix. So, Linux wasn't that uncomfortable for me. Oh, it's restarting. This is typical. All right, so I'll go ahead and hit restart now. I now have screens. Okay. It looks like Windows 11. It looks like I have arrived. All right, so I'm going back into settings. And then it opens. Good. At least they're consistent about, I launch it on that page. And this is something that Linux does not do this. Linux does not do this. If you launch an app on a particular screen, then it comes up on that screen. Unless your screen powered off for some reason. But I've never seen Linux do that before. The difference between Linux and Windows. Windows itself does not have any device drivers in it whatsoever. So each manufacturer that builds a device for Windows or has some feature that needs a driver has to supply the driver, and then sometimes they will they'll make them available to, I guess, Microsoft through the store or whatever, so that when Windows is installing, they'll pick those up and install them for you. But yeah, Linux, on the other hand, this is good and bad, right? So on the one hand, you have to go to a million places on Windows to keep all your devices updated, but you can put the latest hardware on Windows and you can keep it running. Linux, on the other hand, all the device drivers are inside the kernel. So, and there's a few that aren't. There's a few that run outside in userland, but mostly they're in the kernel. So you have to wait until the kernel developers either A, write an open source driver, or B, the vendor of whatever it is, like NVIDIA, for example, writes a proprietary driver, or AMD writes an open source driver and makes it available for Linux, and then Linux can pick it up and use it. So a lot of people complain that Linux takes too long to get new hardware supported, but it's the issue here is really it's a economics problem. Windows has the bulk of the market, so if you're going to develop a device, you're going to want to sell it to the most people that you can. And if you're just going to publish, if you're going to waste time and build a driver for Linux, you're probably not going to make your money back on the time it took you to develop the driver, and that's the truth. Whereas on Windows, you could sell 1 million copies of that particular device that you're selling, and your device driver cost is so small you can't even see it. So yeah, people try to make Linux into Windows, and that's not going to work. And it doesn't work trying to make Windows into Linux. That doesn't work either. See the File Explorer. So we're in dark mode, and I'm looking at this, and I'm seeing the same design that Windows NT introduced. This is, let's see, if I go to this PC, where's this PC? Is it here? Do they still refer to it as, yep, there it is. This PC, oh yeah. Same. Yeah, this is a little dated Microsoft. Yeah, don't you think you might want to update? This is the File Explorer, and yeah, this hasn't changed much in 40 years almost. They have some more color to it. I mean, originally it didn't have all these colors, but the basic design is exactly the same. So let me just talk about some of their rules. And on how they're doing this. So it's a challenge for a month to stay on Linux, and there's penalties involved if you leave it early. So there are tasks that have to be completed each week, and then a wrap up on the 5th week. So, and I guess at that point they'd make some decision about whether to stay or to go back on Windows. So the first part of the challenge is just to pick a distro and install it, and then install the game and get it up and running. That's the first thing that they had challenged themselves with. The second week was to get streaming working, and I assume that meant that they had to get OBS and all of the supporting software to handle audio, and if they have any special way of bringing in video footage or any titles and all of that sort of thing. So the third week is to generate as many game launchers as possible and install those on their Linux build. Now, maybe that makes sense to them, but it doesn't make sense for me. So when I'm evaluating Windows, what I am going to do, I'm replacing that one with, I'm going to try to install as much open source software on Windows as I can that also has open source versions of the same packages available on Linux. So the fourth part is to edit videos, create a document, print it, and then watch a Netflix movie, I guess, is the plan there. So I'll do the same. And then part 5 is to do the concluding remarks. So they have had a number of during the WAN show, they have had a number of comments that they've made during the past 3. Well, the challenge should be over by now, and they should be summarizing sometime this week. So we'll see what they come up with. So my first goal was to install Windows. Now, I haven't worked with Windows in almost 10 years. Hasn't been on any of my personal machines since, well, let me put it this way. It was Windows 8 was the last time. So what is that, 2008? It was shortly thereafter. I didn't even run Windows 8 for any length of time. I mean, having already suffered through Vista and then getting Windows 7, I was kind of, that was a good release. And then for Windows, and then Windows 8 came, and it was like, oh no, here we go again. And so, yeah, at that point, I just said, I'm going to look for an alternative, and I went to Linux at that point. I started to do the install, and I ran into some problems. The first problem was I'm installing this on a Lenovo. I went to look around for a laptop that I had that was modern, had the features that I thought it needed for Windows 11, because ultimately that's where I'm going to go. So I And of course, I can't test it without being on Windows, so Windows 10 made more sense to install it as a stepping stone to go up to 11 rather than go direct against the hardware. I could have done that, but then it would have been, okay, it failed, but why? So I wanted to make sure that I could get Windows up and running on it first, get it stable, and then I would move to 11. So the first problem I ran into was that the Windows 10 installer did not respect the thermal energy management of the machine. So it immediately has problems with keeping the fans running. It doesn't turn them on, and the machine is getting hot. Eventually, about the time where you reach the point where you tell you don't want Cortana, that's when it shut down. It just went, it thermal throttled on me. And that's not a good condition. You don't want to take your machine to the point of a thermal throttle, because the enemy of your hardware and your electronics is heat. Heat degrades electronics slowly over time, and there are problems that usually show up about 6 months later. So yeah, as the circuitry degrades from the initial, it's just like having the engine oil light go on in your car. Once the engine oil light goes on, the pressure of the oil is so low that you've already done damage to the engine. Same thing here, you've already taken the temperature so high that you've already done some damage to the electronics potentially. That's not a good thing. So I hadn't noticed that it was hot. I hadn't had my hand on the back of the keyboard, and I put it there, and wow, it was hot. So I propped up the laptop and just had a fan blowing air under it, not up into it. I didn't want to spin the fans. That probably would have been the wrong direction, and that wouldn't have been good for the electronics, because you can run voltage backwards through fans. They're essentially a generator. So the second problem I ran into was that Windows, it was very slow, first of all. I mean, slow to a crawl in trying to get it to respond to anything. And the reason for that, as I looked all over the system to try to find the task manager, it's been a long time since I have used Windows, as I said, so I had to go and find all this stuff that I was familiar with in the past and figure out what applications were running and taking up CPU resources, memory resources, and it turned out Windows was installing drivers in the background, which is, the last time I installed Windows didn't really spend a whole lot of time installing drivers. It just kind of left that up to you. So yeah, it would give you, and the device manager would give you a list of devices that it couldn't load any drivers for. It was unknown, and that created an issue for me. The issue it created is that Windows apparently does not check to see if the driver version is compatible with the particular release level. So it had been actively updating the system up to, I think it's 21H, and there are drivers on the Lenovo site that are specifically version for that particular version of Windows, and so they failed, and they started creating errors, and I started seeing weird problems, like the network was connecting and disconnecting and connecting and disconnecting, and this is a hard network, not a Wi-Fi network. So but anyway, I discovered what the problem was, and I stopped Windows from doing that any further, and then I installed the Lenovo drivers from their website and got it up and running. I kind of get it, why they do that is just try to make it more friendly for new people that are new. If they're bothering to install Windows, most of the people that I know that use Windows, they don't bother with trying to understand how to install it, because they buy machines that already have the software installed and ready to go. So the third thing I noticed was that as it was going through the installation process, there was a lot of restarts. I mean, I'm not used to that with Linux. I'm not used to seeing, oh, we got to restart. And the same thing with the updates. You get over to the updates, you think you're done. It says, oh, your system's up to date. And then you hit the check button, and all of a sudden 10 more things pop up, and you go, oh, I got to do this again. And then at the end, there'd be another restart, and you'd hit it again. There'd be 2 things that would pop up, and it would go through the restart again. So yeah, it seems like there's an awful lot of times where Windows restarts. Now, in comparison to Linux, Linux does on occasion require a restart, particularly if it's a firmware or it's a kernel update. But if it's a service patch, to a background service, usually all you have to do is just restart the service, not the machine. So I just find that really strange. And the other thing is, when you update Linux, the updates come as an aggregate. Now, I have seen it where you've done an update and you think you're done, and then you run it again and there's another package ready. And a lot of times that's because the developers are releasing packages at the same time that you're doing your update. So they haven't completed everything yet, but they have been pushing stuff up to the repo servers for you. One of the advantages of Linux is that, all the updates are bundled together, and whatever you do install them, you get them all at once. So if you do have to restart, it's one time. It's not this thing that Windows always does. The third thing was to find some basic applications that I need in order to work in my lab here. And the first thing I need is SSH. I need both a server and a client. So yeah, I could install PuTTY, I guess, but I've never really cared much for PuTTY. To me, the user interface on PuTTY is a throwback to the early days of Windows. And it's not a very pretty interface, it's not a very functional interface, and it's not very SSH-like. So it's not my favorite tool to use for SSH. I used to use a commercial one when I was on Windows. So I looked and I found a GUI version called Bitwise, and it is free. There's a community edition of it. There's also a paid version of it as well, which provides additional features. So I downloaded that. I could have downloaded some others, like Transmission also has some features of SSH in it, like SFTP. But I needed to have both the client and the server, and Bitwise had both. So I could have gone into PowerShell and installed Microsoft's SSH server and client, but one of the comments that Linus made during, I think it was a week ago, said that he doesn't remember a time where he had to go to a Windows command line to install something, and here he was having to do that with Linux. And so I took that to heart and said, okay, fine. I won't go to the command line on Windows and install the Microsoft PowerShell version of SSH server and SSH client. So, because that would have violated that, I would have been down in the command line. As far as functionality is concerned, one of the things that I noticed is that the first time, now on laptops, your primary display is the laptop display. And then if you plug in a secondary monitor, that becomes your secondary display, and then you can choose if you want to mirror it or extend the two or whatever. So what I noticed, I was running it extended. What I noticed is that if I launched an application up here somewhere, then that application would launch in the primary window and not where I called for. And then this is still here. I always laughed about this, is that you have file name extensions and hidden items that you can you can either hide them or display them. Windows' legacy comes from MS-DOS, and MS-DOS file extensions had meaning. Like they used the exe file to identify the file as an executable. For example, COM was another one where it was a common executable, and you would execute files with COM as well. There was also a rudimentary shell script or a scripting language for DOS where you could use that as well. But then they started identifying images with JPEG and PNG and all those kinds of things, and those have meaning to the operating system. One of the things that you'll find out right away if you use Linux is that, and that is the philosophy of Unix in general, a file is a file is a file. Linux and Unix, they don't care about file extensions. They use what is the metadata of the file, what's the internals look like, to determine what it is. It's actually intelligent. It determines what that file is. Now, their problem with it was being able to run scripts. The problem with scripts are, to the operating system, they can either be a text file, because I might want to edit it, or they might be something you want to run. And that is something that you have to consider there. I always hear people refer to Linux as the command line interface. No, that is incorrect. The only operating systems that have a command line interface is Windows. Windows has a command line interface. Linux and Unix have shell. Shell is a boundary layer between you and the kernel. And it is used to do a lot of different functions and features. And Yeah, it is not a command line interface. I wish people would stop using that term. It is meaningless on Linux and Unix. I mean, they have definitely done some work on dressing up things like if I go here and I go into settings, this looks really good. I mean, this is organized really well. It's obvious that Microsoft spends some money with focus groups. Focus groups are usually conducted by marketing in order to determine how users will interact with the system, whether they like something or hate it. And so it helps them direct how they design the operating system, because a lot of the things that we see and feel and do, that's all personal. That's something that you either like the way it works or you hate the way it works. It doesn't seem like there's ever any in-between in that. So focus groups really help to cement what users like, and maybe you can then learn something from that and then provide those kinds of tools and those kinds of features to the users on future releases. Linux, on the other hand, is left up entirely to the developers. There are no focus groups. There's no money for it. There's no multi-million-dollar cache of money that's in the background that these companies can draw from. And who would the company be that would do that? Would it be the GNOME development group? Would it be the XFCE development group? Would it be the distro that's incorporating the XFCE or GNOME desktop interface or top environment into the Linux distro? So there's really three things in conclusion that I have. And this stems way back. I've gone through a number of transitions over the years, going from mainframes to PCs, going from PCs to workstations and so forth. One of the biggest changes that happened was going from MS-DOS to Windows. Why was that such a big deal? Well, a lot of the people back then were using WordPerfect to do their word processing. Word processing was a very big thing because everybody had to write reports, they had to do daily statuses, and yeah, they had to make it look nice. So WordPerfect, a lot of these people invested, a lot of time to learn it. There was a lot of keys, a lot of shortcuts, a lot of function keys, all this stuff. The manual for WordPerfect, as I remember, was about that thick. And yeah, there was just all kinds of stuff you could do. And in order to become proficient and quick with it, you had to memorize them. In fact, I remember seeing templates over the keyboard that people would use just to help them remember all of the shortcuts in order to jog their memory that, oh yeah, this key does that. When we went over to Windows, the first thing they wanted to do was bring WordPerfect with them. Well, that kind of defeats the purpose. If you're bringing an MS-DOS app over to one where you can have multiple applications up and running, and you're bringing DOS applications, that really kind of complicates things in terms of being able to copy and paste in order to be able to resize the window and actually have things change without looking at like it's really small. The other problem you had is because it was running under Windows, you had an extra layer on top that was going to affect the performance of that machine that was underneath. So the first thing that we looked at, I remember, was to look at WordPerfect for Windows, which was the graphical version of it. You probably haven't heard of WordPerfect for Windows because it was the most awful thing I've ever seen. I think they rushed it into development. They rushed it through development, didn't bother to test it, and it was loaded with bugs. It crashed, and it burned, and it lost documents, and it scrambled text. It was just one nightmare. Fortunately, we had not rolled it out. We just tested it on a few people. And they were so mad about it. They were like, oh, I'm going back to DOS right now. I can't use this. So that's the first reaction that you get. People don't want to learn something new. They always want to make the new thing look like the old thing. So like in Linus's case, he's coming from Windows going to Linux. He's not willing to invest any time in learning Linux. He wants Linux to work exactly like Windows. He wants it to game like Windows. He wants it to look and feel to be like Windows. He wants to be able to install drivers like Windows. Well, it's not Windows, and you can't make it Windows. Any more than when I'm going this way, I can make Windows look like and be Linux. Sure, there's WSL, the Windows subsystem for Linux, sure. But that's not a Linux experience. That's running Linux underneath of Windows with whatever warts Microsoft programs on top of it. So, but that's not a Linux experience. And there's Wine for Linux that attempts to run Windows apps to some varying degrees of success. But compatibility applications are meant to help transition. They're not meant to be the end game. That's the point. They're meant to, okay, so while you're learning this new system, here, we'll let you kind of use your old apps. There's other ways you can do it too. I mean, I could install Windows VM under Linux and kind of do my stuff over there. But then you're duplicating the operating systems. You've got the overhead of Linux plus the overhead of Windows. So your performance is probably not going to be what you saw under a pure Windows against the hardware environment. The other problem that you have is that when you get into drivers, for example, Windows doesn't ship with any drivers. They never have. They don't provide it. It's not their thing. It's not their problem. They instead publish a standard. And they say, if you want to write and develop some hardware, these are the standards you have to apply in order to push a driver out and have it run successfully in a Windows environment. So it's up to the people that are developing the hardware or the component or whatever to make that driver work. It's not Microsoft's problem. Microsoft does have drivers because they have hardware that they produce, but the majority of it is somebody else's problem. They come in third party. Linux, on the other hand, is completely different. Linux doesn't. Well, you can install drivers under Linux. It's possible, but it's not common. It's possible, but it's not common. Most of the drivers are inside the kernel, and the ones that are inside the kernel are done by the development team. So how do those drivers get there? Reverse engineering a lot of it. So they reverse engineer what the proprietary drivers do under Windows or Mac, and then they figure out what they need to have to respond to the call, and they build a driver that allows that hardware to work. You're always behind the curve whenever you do that because it's based on someone else's work. It doesn't matter if it could be. Look, let's take example a file transfer system called SMB or CIFS if you prefer. But SMB is controlled by Microsoft. That is their standard. They developed it. They support it. They write the code. They maintain it. Linux code works at the sufferance of Microsoft. If Microsoft decides, hey, screw you, Linux, we're going to change everything. We're going to change the API or reformat the headers. We're going to change the way it logs in. We're going to change the way the files come back. Maybe we're going to send them backwards to you this time. So they could completely screw Linux out of any kind of success. Who gets blamed for that? Is it Microsoft for making the change? No, because their stuff will work on their stuff. I mean, all the Windows that are out there will get that update, and they'll work fine. You, on the other hand, are screwed. So if you're on, who's going to get the blame? It's going to be Linux. That's the nature of the beast. That's how it works. So that's one issue. When you're adopting a new platform, you've got to, at some point, go all in. Yeah, sure. You could transition into it slowly. You can start out on Windows. You could bring down there are a number of open source applications that run under Windows that also are native to Linux. So you could kick the tires on it. You could see if that application is going to work for you, if it has enough features that you're looking for in order to replace maybe the thing that you're currently using on Windows. And if it isn't, then maybe Linux isn't right for you, and that's fine. It's all about how. I mean, I hear people, "Wow, you're using Windows. You're an idiot." It's really up to you to decide what's best for you. That other person, you don't know how they're using the system, and chances are it probably works fine for them, but it probably won't work fine for you because it's different. So you need to sit down and figure that out, whether or not this particular move is good for you. Second thing, and I think it's really unfair that Luke and Linus are given Linux such a short time. It's like saying, well, I mean, I'm sure that they didn't learn Windows in a month. I'll bet money on it. It's, they both have been working with Windows since they were kids, I'm sure. And they probably spent hours and hours and hours on it. And they were willing to invest the time. They're not willing to invest the time with Linux. Why is that? Why aren't they investing the time to learn Linux? If you're gonna give it a fair shake, and you're gonna learn it, you can transition, and you can mess around with Wine, and you can mess around with Lutris, and you can mess around with Proton, and you can mess around with Steam until you're blue in the face trying to get your games to run, or you can go all in. You can say, well, those games are only going to run natively on Windows, so I got to keep a Windows machine up to run those games. But I'm all in. I'm going to run where I can everything on Linux that I possibly can, and then make my decisions going forward whether or not I want to maintain that other platform just to run a few games or not. So it's a chicken and egg problem. The more the demand is for a thing, the more likely the game developers will first release on that platform. If Linux becomes popular, becomes used, then the game platforms the developers of the game platforms are going to go, oh, maybe I should release this on Linux first because I'll sell more copies over there than I will under Windows. Right now, that isn't the case. They're ignoring Linux. Linux is a blip. It's a nothing to them. They don't care. It probably isn't even worth the translation of the system over to Linux, or even it probably isn't even worth testing. Probably isn't worth the money to test it based on how much revenue that they might get back from the game. So yeah, it's all business equations. It's all business decision. So my advice, first, don't try to make the platform that you're coming from look, feel, and smell like the one you're trying to move to. That's silly. Second, if you start to use things, test them out in the environment that you're currently in. See if it's something you like. If it isn't what you like, move on. The second thing is, don't try to stick with protocols and things that are owned by the platform you're moving from. If they're proprietary, and SMB is proprietary, they just happen to have somebody who's reverse engineered it, and Microsoft didn't sue the crap out of them for doing it. But they managed to do that. Now, some of it is an open source today, but it wasn't when it was originally written. Yeah, I mean, that's the danger if you don't control the standard. And use the standards that are present to you and learn them. And then the third thing is take time, invest it, invest your time wisely, and learn the system. And I know it's human nature to compare where you're coming from to where you're going. That's good if you're evaluating. But take the time to evaluate up front. Don't do it while you're trying to learn it. That's the wrong time to do things. You're at the wrong end of the ladder on that one. You're already up on the roof at that point. I mean, if you find out that it's unsafe to go back down, you're stuck on the roof. So, yeah, that's not the right time to do that. So, anyway, that's all I had for today. Hope you enjoyed this. No operating system is perfect, and that's where I'm going to leave it right there. If you like this, please like and subscribe. Hope to see you all again real soon, and bye for now.